Hello and welcome to the Atlas Agency, a channel all about Arkham Horror, the card game. I'm your host Brandon, and in this video I'll be sharing my thoughts on the scenario portion of the City of Archives, the fourth Mythos Pack of the Forgotten Age cycle. Out of all the games in Fantasy Flight's Arkham Files line, and perhaps even Lovecraftian board and card games as a whole, I think it's possible that Arkham Horror the card game is the game that's best able to really make full use of the diverse canon of weird fiction that underpins Lovecraftian gaming. I feel like you would probably have to look to the role-playing arena if you wanted to find a game that could top the Arkham LCG when it comes to being able to bring a diverse range of weird tales to life at the gaming table. Beyond the fact that Arkham is just a narrative-rich game in general, there are a few things I would point to make that case. First, there's the flexibility of the gameplay itself. The act and agenda systems make dynamic objectives a natural part of the game, which I think widens the range of stories that the game is capable of emulating. There's also the pace of the expansion schedule. With new content almost monthly, I think there's just more time for Arkham to explore different stories, and I think you're able to take more risks in the things that you attempt than you might do if there were just one or two expansions per year. Along those same lines, because new content for the game is all card-based, components aren't as much of a limiting factor in the settings and stories that the game can use as they might be for other titles. If you wanted to send investigators in, say, Mansions of Madness to Egypt, you could do it, but it'd be a bigger affair. You'd be looking not just at new cards, but also new boards and probably miniatures, probably a big box expansion. But give Arkham Horror the card game one deck of cards, and it can get you to Egypt or Venice or really any other setting, so there's a great deal of freedom there. And then finally, when it comes to dealing with horror stories, I think Arkham's campaign play is an asset in adapting those as well. There's a greater sense of attachment when you play a character over an 8-scenario series, which I think allows for the horror elements to hit the player harder than they might in a one-off game, and that's certainly true of the City of Archives. I think up to this point, the best example of the card game utilizing its fictional underpinnings was Path to Carcosa's A Phantom of Truth, which crafted a gameplay experience around the short story In the Court of the Dragon from the King in Yellow. That sort of put you in that story and was a real treat for fans of Chambers' King in Yellow. With the City of Archives, though, I think A Phantom of Truth has been dethroned. City of Archives is directly inspired by one of Lovecraft's most famous weird tales, The Shadow Out of Time, and it succeeds, I think, fantastically at bringing that story to life, to a degree that I don't think many board or card games could accomplish, at least definitely not in the space of 44 cards. Now, up to this point in the campaign, the Forgotten Age has had a pretty loose relationship with the fiction that inspired it. Unlike, say, the Dunwich Legacy, which treats the events of Lovecraft's Dunwich Horror as canon and basically acts as an unofficial sequel to that story, the Forgotten Age so far has drawn only general inspiration from a handful of stories, and it's been more about capturing the general feel of a weird fiction pulp adventure story. City of Archives then seems kind of like a hard left turn for the Forgotten Age. Not only is it drawing from Lovecraft in a much more direct fashion than anything in the campaign's first half, it's also using a story that's pretty distant from the setting and the events of the campaign up to this point. When this was announced, I sort of felt like this could have been dropped into any campaign. But actually playing this scenario convinced me otherwise. It does hit you out of left field at first, but it's actually well integrated and well utilized in the Forgotten Age. It conveys some plot information that might have otherwise been difficult for the game to get across. The community opinion on the Forgotten Age campaign as a whole has been fairly divided, and from what I've seen, that seems to be true of City of Archives individually as well, though maybe to a lesser extent. I definitely count myself among the Arkham fans who've been less enthusiastic about this cycle. For me, with the exception of Threads of Fate, this has been kind of a bumpy ride. I've already kind of alluded to the fact that I appreciate the theme and story of City of Archives, but that's never the whole picture, so what do I think of this scenario? Well, I'm glad to say I think City of Archives is actually really good. Enough so that it's almost certainly a contender for being in my all-time top 10 scenarios for the game, alongside Threads of Fate from earlier this cycle. But whereas Threads of Fate is a great example of what I would think of as a traditional Arkham gameplay experience, City of Archives is a much more unconventional, experimental scenario. It's a bit more of a puzzle, and it requires players to adjust and adapt in order to succeed. This is one scenario that you can't just approach on autopilot. Every scenario has a unique hook of some sort. Some are more dramatic than others. City of Archives is built around a major gameplay hook that's both interesting and incredibly thematic, and it makes for a really memorable gameplay experience. The scenario can be kind of disorienting at first as you try to work out how to best approach it, Because of the theme, though, I think that's actually a really good thing. It's a feature, not a bug. In fact, it's one of the things I love most about this scenario, the fact that the experience of your character is paralleled by your experience as the player, especially in your initial playthroughs of the scenario as you kind of first come to terms with the situation. The gameplay kind of helps to put you in your character's shoes, and I think that's fantastic. Now, speaking of characters, I think this is a scenario that's going to be harder for some investigators than it is for others, or rather, harder for some decks than it is for others, especially if you're encountering City of Archives for the first time and don't know what to expect or how to prepare. And I think that may be a big factor among those players who didn't care for this scenario, this feeling that the scenario is robbing you of some of the tools that you've become accustomed to relying on, kind of similar to the reaction to the main path locations back in Where Doom Awaits. I wasn't bothered by that myself, but I think it's an understandable reaction. I think it might come down to how hard the scenario hits you in your first encounter with it. On subsequent playthroughs, I think most investigators should be able to prepare for this well enough that it isn't a source of frustration, and for me, the thematic payoff was definitely worth it. Wrapping up then, I'm obviously really pleased with City of Archives. The previous two Mythos packs were kind of off for me, but this was a major thematic home run, with some really enjoyable gameplay backing that up. If you're a fan of The Shadow Out of Time, then there's a good chance the City of Archives is going to resonate especially well with you, but even if you don't know or love that story, if you're interested in having a very different, unique Arkham gameplay experience, this pack is one to look forward to. That's it for this little transfer of knowledge. Hopefully all of this makes its way safely into the Great Library. As always, thanks for watching the Atlas Agency, and good luck in your own investigations of the Mythos, wherever and whenever those investigations might take you.